Thank you, Nicole. How's everyone doing tonight? Thank you for coming. Thank you for being part of this event. We felt we need to respond or contribute to the community efforts to support each other during these difficult times. We will share one presentation. It will not be 3 different presentations. It's one presentation, but we make everything a team effort. It just works better that way. So we will do it that way today as well. So these are the questions that maybe you ask yourselves or often are asked in the aftermath of events. And mind you, bad things happening to people all the time. We are here because of events last week, obviously, but we will give our talk in a bit more universal context or light. So the questions we will attempt to answer or discuss rather today is: what is psychological trauma? What are the reactions to trauma, and what are the reactions which are usual and not unhealthy, although painful nevertheless? And what are the reactions which may indicate that there might be more difficulties down the road? We will talk about traumatic loss on a different scale, a personal loss, or something which is experienced now a lot is like loss, what's called collective loss or collective grief as well. How do people grieve? How we cope? How we cope with things we witness, we experienced, exposed to, which are injuring our minds, and how we can help others, how we can help loved ones, friends, and family. So this is the scope, and now this week again we're talking a lot about traumatic events, about trauma, because this is what people say, how they define this experience. It's something shocks you, something just takes feet under you away, and you don't know what to expect, what to feel. You feel scared, you feel confused. So that's called traumatic. In a definition of a traumatic event, there are certain statements which need to be understood. So the traumatic event includes the exposure to actual or threatening death or serious injury, accident, assault, different things, maybe natural disaster, it may be man-made violence, which is always worse, or sexual violence. And this exposure to kind of count as a traumatic event which is likely to cause harmful consequences has to be either directly experienced, so I am the one who was attacked, I am the one who was in a car accident, witnessed in person. So this is always very hard for people to witness something happening to someone else, and sometimes they can help, sometimes they cannot help, and it leaves person often deeply affected. Now, another bad situation is learning about an event that happened to a loved one. So there's distinction, not just learning about the event happened to someone you maybe don't know very well or don't know at all, but about loved one, because this is an injury to the attachment. It's a major threat, because if something happens to your, God forbid, loved one, then it's threat to your well-being and also loss. So it's always very difficult, and also repetitive or extreme exposure to details of the event. So just from the previous one, how many of you were in a lockdown situation on Wednesday? Many people. So speaking about witnessing certain situation of scare, just confusion, unknowing, expecting worst thing to happen. I mean, these are natural things going through a mind, and this is something takes time to come to terms with. And finally, the repetitive or extreme exposure to details of certain traumatic event. So that's often people who deal with things as part of their job, maybe, or assignments. It may be, teacher in school where violent things are happening. It may be a first responder whose day-to-day is confronted with challenging situation. It may be someone who is collecting human remains. It may be different things. But this is what is also a footnote on this definition is that what doesn't really count is if this exposure happens over a media or television. So it's assumed that exposure through media, television, or someone tell you about these things is more remote and shouldn't really affect you, to an extent that is causing harmful consequences. But these days it may be different, experienced differently, because the exposure to things on the media, on the newspaper, on the television, especially visual things, they might get into your mind, and some people will be more vulnerable to that than others. So if it's not even, it doesn't count like a trauma in terms of definition, like in psychiatric classification, doesn't mean it doesn't have stressful and negative and consequences, and should be just brushed away. So there is if something happens, from your own experiences, it's just stepping a bit back, speaking about traumatic events. It's not as if they are rare and unique and something that doesn't happen often enough. These studies, like research, epidemiological research, show that about 70% of just random general population of adults will experience in their lifetime at least one event which will qualify as a traumatic. It's not a rare event. We like to think it's rare, right? It's easier to live our lives when we don't think all the time that bad things happening very often, but they do. So the reactions might be really a variety. As Nicole said, we are all different, and we have different experiences, and we're coming into this with some of our past or present, which may make us more or less vulnerable. But usually, if we try to dissect these reactions, we can talk about thoughts, like fearful thoughts. Often, what is more bothersome is intrusive or unwanted thoughts that you try to kind of push away, but still they're coming back. Also, not only thoughts, but images. Imagery is very, very powerful, actually. It powerfully affects our brain and our body. And nightmares or just vivid memories may be something that is really bothersome. And it interferes with our ability to keep our normal thought process. We kind of tend to lose concentration or think about many different things at the same time, like racing thoughts, and it's all results in a lot of distress. The different emotions. These are negative emotions. Often they are around like threat, response to threat. So it's fear, it's anger. Many people felt angry Wednesday. That's understandable. Loss of life. All the context what was there. But sometimes it's getting stuck emotionally, and it becomes really poisonous. Anger is not helpful for anything. It's destructive, really. Guilt and shame, especially for people who are witnessing something, who are not able to really contribute. They might start doubting themselves. Did I do the right thing? Why I didn't do that? Why I didn't say something? Why I didn't, why maybe it's my fault. And of course, the grief and sadness, reaction to loss, reaction to irreversible loss of life or injury. Now, then we do something differently, perhaps, in this context of this reaction. And the things that we do may be positive. There are actually lots of really functional is a very technical word, very helpful behaviors that people displayed, continue displaying. As we will talk about these things a bit later as well. But what are the most problematic is avoidance. And avoidance initially is kind of normal and understandable instinct, stay away from trouble. That's sometimes a really helpful way of surviving. But what we call effortful avoidance is just, you know, just conscious decision that, well, it's too hard. I cannot stand this, so I'd rather not go there, I'd rather not talk to anyone. I'd rather, like, you know, try to isolate myself a bit more. Maybe it's easier for me to manage. Maybe it will go away. Well, you know what? It's not going away that easily if you avoid. So we always encourage people, well, you know, the world is the same world. It's as safe as it was before. It's not always safe. It's not, you know, take anything for granted, but don't change anything just because of fear. Succumbing to fear is the worst thing you can do. Do things because of your reason, because of what you do when you're feeling well. Do these things. And other things like coping, like, you know, it's easier to have a beer or, you know, 6 beers, I don't know how many. Maybe it's easier to fall asleep and not to think about it, not think, you know, how I go to work and I know that there's someone who may be suffering, what I going to be feeling around this person or something like that. And checking vigilance, try to make sure that, you know, that no one is there, that doors are locked. You know, doors are locked, that's fine. You know, don't open your doors at night. But sometimes if you are seeing that you're doing it not because it makes sense, but because you are afraid inside, and this becomes a way how you decrease your own anxiety, you know, pay attention. This is not working. You need to kind of look the other way. And physical symptoms, will not go into many details. They are symptoms of tension, and there are symptoms of fatigue, and sleep is disrupted. So these reactions to trauma, they are all, you know, bad, and they may become something worse. But in immediate aftermath to reaction to something threatening is happening, they are common, and they don't mean that something abnormal is going on. You have to accept that bad things happens, we feel bad, and it's going to last for a while. But it doesn't mean that we will all have PTSD. In fact, we will not. Unfortunately, there is lots of research in this area, because there's no shortage of all kind of bad things happening to many people around the world. And whatever situation you look at, you look roughly at those who are exposed on terms we described before to traumatic event. We have about perhaps 15% of people who react strongly and continue having severe symptoms, which may be post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or other psychological disorders. While about 50% of people in the situation will have reasonable distress, kind of explainable distress, and will not have any symptoms shortly after. So they are what we call resilient from the start. And there is about, 25% of people on top of that who will have significant distress at first, but will recover. They will bounce back. They are later resilient people. So we have about 75% of people who, over a period of time of, you know, several weeks or maybe months for what it takes, will do really, you know, will be fine. Now we have, on the other side of things, we have people who will react strongly, and as I mentioned before, will continue having symptoms. And we will have a smaller group, about 5%, who react not very strongly, with no obvious distress or need for any mental health services or anything like that. But over time, they will show what's called delayed onset or delayed expression of psychological disorder. So these are all possible scenarios. The bottom line is we are wired for resilience, and I think in the past week we have plenty of evidence for that. So we're talking often, especially with our patients, in terms of in course of the therapy, we're talking about natural recovery. So what happens, like what is happening with this resilience? So there are transient symptoms, but soon after, for most people, they will be declining, not interfering with functioning and well-being so much. And in the first year, usually, most people will, by the end of this time, will do fine after certain, you know, I'm not talking about current events now, but in general. And it's very well known, it's a bit simplified, but this is the bottom line here, that recovery is associated with continuing your usual life and even perhaps having some aspect of, growing certain strength. Now, it may not happen because of certain things. There are certain things that interfere with natural recovery. This is how we conceptualize post-traumatic stress disorder. Natural recovery is not happening because of something, and this something is targeted in therapy. And you see here plenty of targets for therapy. Avoidance can be targeted with exposure type of therapy, and certain safety behaviors, as we will be talking about them later, can be targeted. And we are talking now therapy for disorder, but on a certain scale, if we need to watch it, that we are not engaging in this type of reactions and behaviors overly over a longer period of time. We have to give it to ourselves that we react this way, and for a certain time, this is okay and this is normal, but it is not something we expect ourselves to continue doing. We expect ourselves to doing it less and less and doing normal things more and more. We're moving on to more specific topic of traumatic loss, and Katie will take over the mic.
Good evening. I'm going to be speaking tonight about the concept of traumatic loss, and specifically this is something that's a death that is sudden, that's unexpected, and often violent in nature. It can be caused by a variety of factors. It might be by other people, it might be a natural disaster, it could be something like suicide. It's something that's catastrophic and unexpected and results in a loss. So there's many common reactions to a traumatic loss that we can all feel. Certainly many of us may be feeling some of these as a result of last week's tragedy. It's very normal and common to feel shocked after a trauma. We might have a difficult time accepting that something like this could happen, that it could happen to us or happen in our city. We might intellectually know the facts, but it might feel emotionally very foreign at the same time. People can also have the experience of feeling very flat or very numb and not really being able to access the emotions that they know are in there somewhere. But that numbness is also a very common experience in the early aftermath of trauma. Other common things to look out for are things like memories or images that, as Dr. Shlik was saying, might come into our minds again and again. They're usually unwanted. We might find that we're having dreams or nightmares, or maybe we don't remember the content of the dream per se, but we wake up feeling anxious and maybe a bit on edge, and we know that we were dreaming about something that upset us. So these are common reactions in the early days. Fear and anxiety, of course, is also very common and expected. We might find that activities that we usually were quite mundane and routine and felt very safe are suddenly feeling very unsafe to us. We might be a bit startled, or that might be unexpected. We might find that we're worrying about what could happen down the road. We have a sense of doom or dread, or as if something bad might be coming. Again, that's the brain's response to an unexpected traumatic loss. So our threat center has been activated, and our brain is kind of on edge and really looking around the environment and registering even neutral stimuli as threatening, and that's common in the early aftermath. Feeling angry again is another very expected emotion to experience. In terms of evolution, anger is meant to really propel us towards action. It's meant to propel us to defend or protect our loved ones or ourselves for the sake of survival. So it is quite expected that after last week we might feel sort of an urge to act or an urge to do something and make things a bit better or ease someone's suffering. Guilt and regret are very common as well. So we could be turning over scenarios in our minds after a traumatic loss. We might think about what we should have done differently or could have done differently. That's a very natural reaction. We might feel some guilt that we are alive in certain cases. If we've been through something where others are not, we might feel guilty about getting back to our usual life. So all of these experiences and emotions that we are having are expected because it's a sign that the brain is trying to process and integrate this very foreign information that's outside of our usual frame of reference or our usual experiences. And so that just means that our brain is doing its job in the natural recovery process. So what can we do? What can we do if we ourselves have been through a traumatic incident or a traumatic loss? And what can we do to support and help other people around us or our loved ones? Or if we're in the role of a first responder, how might we help in the early aftermath? I think the first thing to really mark for ourselves and take note of is that we will be grieving, and that is a healthy, natural response. Grief is really the ongoing, very personal process of trying to reconcile what happened and how our lives will be forever changed as a result of what happened. It affects us in terms of our behaviors and how we act, how we think, how we feel, how we are with other people in our lives. It may affect us in a spiritual sense. Basically, it's a whole body experience that trickles down into all the aspects of what it means to be human. There's no right way to grieve. There's no proper way of doing it. It's a very personal, very unique experience, and that's to be expected. One of the most important things we can do for ourselves or for other people when we are grieving, particularly after a traumatic loss, is to accept nurturance and support as best we can, and to the extent that's possible, provide nurturance and support to other people in our lives. It's that connection with other humans that can be so healing and so supportive, especially during the sort of shock and the early aftermath of something very difficult happening. As people grieve and go through that in their own unique way, sometimes people start to notice, I need to mark this for myself. I need to honor or remember this person. I need to do something to respect or honor their memory. And that's a wonderful thing, and that can be really helpful for us. We can do that in an individual way, or we can do that as well in a collective manner. And I think if we walk past the War Memorial in downtown Ottawa, we see a beautiful example of what it means to respect and honor as a community. Because grief is a whole body experience, it's very important to make sure we're taking care of ourselves in the physical sense. We want to make sure that we're getting sleep and rest, that we're making sure our nutrition is on board, we're moving and getting some exercise as best we can, and again, that we're in a support network, in a strong support network with other people. Grief, in essence, slows the body down. We might feel kind of like we're underwater, like we can't think as quickly, we can't move as quickly, and that's the brain's recovery process, really. It's doing its job. And so when we are in that slowed down, I guess, moment, that's fine to kind of take a break from your usual routines and activities. As Dr. Shlik was saying, one of the most important things to hold on to, though, is that we do eventually get back to our usual routines or our new routines, whatever that might look like. So that's really important to remember. The difficulty can come up for folks when we find that we're actually in time having a hard time getting back to our lives. And Michelle will speak in a few moments about how we know when that's happening and what we can do if we find ourselves in that position. So really, again, our job in the early aftermath of a loss, a traumatic loss, is to let ourselves feel whatever we're feeling, to connect with people in our lives, and to take the time we need to grieve in our own unique way. And as time goes on and we start to return to our usual or our new routine, we might find that we have a little bit more space to consider some really big questions. We might find that we're asking ourselves some pretty big questions about the meaning of life in general, the purpose of our life. Because trauma is so outside of our frame of reference, it can really change the way we see the world around us. It can change the way we see ourselves, and it can change our relationships in the world as well. So it's typical to find yourself asking some big questions of an existential nature even. So it's usually not helpful to try to spin a traumatic loss in a positive light, but what can be really helpful is to come to some form of personal meaning as you're able to in time. And for different people, that looks like different things, but it is a sense of creating a positive legacy. So that might mean that after a trauma, I might really want to find a way to make the world a better place. What can I do to better the world around me? I also might find that I'm no longer taking certain things for granted, maybe my health or maybe my loved ones or that I live in Canada or in Ottawa. Other people talk as well about maybe finding that they're thinking more about their values and what it means to live an authentic life, and they find that they're able to live a little bit more in accordance with those values. So it can really change the way we see ourselves and the world around us. If I switch gears just for a second, I want to touch on what we can do if it's our loved ones or our friends or family who are suffering after a trauma, or if we're in the role of a first responder. How might we help? I think most people feel a sort of call, a sort of urge to do something to help or to make things better, and I think that's very right, and how good. What a good response. Where we have to be a bit careful is when that desire can kind of outstrip the research. And so an example of where this has occurred in the research is an intervention that's known as psychological debriefing or critical incident stress management. And that's a widespread method or model that's used often after natural disasters. And the idea is that usually professionals go in the immediate aftermath and they meet with people who have been exposed to the trauma, and they sit one-on-one or in a group setting and give information about what to expect in terms of our own reactions. But in this model, it asks people to recount the details of the trauma to a greater degree. And we've actually found in our research of late that at best is inert, and at worst can actually make things worse for some people. And so what we realize, as Dr. Shlik was saying, most people recover very naturally. It's the natural recovery process of the brain and the body. And so to interrupt that it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to prevent someone from developing any psychological issues, or that it's very helpful. So because of the research, our new best practice that exists today is something called psychological first aid. And the premise of psychological first aid is that we want to give people in the early aftermath everything they need to be safe and stable, to make sure they have a roof over their head and food in their bellies and people to lean on for support. We want to make sure that they're out of physical danger, that they're actually physically safe. And if we provide those conditions, then the brain has a really great shot of recovering normally. And so that's something that we've started to do. And for first responders, that's an important distinction to make as well. And again, this doesn't mean that we don't want people to talk to us about how they're feeling or what they're thinking. It's really just that we're talking about how people are impacted by the trauma in the current moment, and it's not asking people to go over it in detail in the immediate aftermath. A time for that may come for some people, and we'll talk to that in a moment. So just a little bit more about psychological first aid. Again, if I'm hungry, if I'm tired, if I'm in danger, I'm not going to be able to process and integrate any emotional or psychological material, because if anyone knows about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need to make sure that we're physically okay before we can move on to that level. So the goals of this approach are really to help people to feel connected and valued and safe, like they're around understanding other people who can keep them protected and safe. We want to normalize any emotions or reactions they're having, validate those reactions. And then we want to plant some seeds of signs that we might want to look for that would warrant seeking additional support if someone finds that they're actually not recovering as a certain amount of time passes. And so that's something that we want to keep our eyes on just in case. as we go along. So I'll invite Michelle up, and she'll talk to us some more about psychological first aid and about what to do if we find that we're not recovering.
Thank you, Katie. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to focus now a bit on psychological first aid. And as Katie explained, the purpose of psychological first aid is to provide individuals with a place that they can feel safe, that they can feel comfortable enough to express some of their experiences as it relates to the traumatic event. And again, the goal of psychological first aid is not trauma processing. It's not discussing the details of the event in detail, event by event, but it's more talking about the experiences, the feelings that went about with the event as it occurred. So part of psychological first aid can take two different forms. It can take the form of a group setting, and so that looks like peer support groups, having support groups where each individual, either as friends, as co-workers, can talk about their feelings, talk about their experiences as it relates to the trauma. For those who might not necessarily be comfortable in group settings, the option of individual support becomes then the best fit for them. Reviewing the event in as basic detail as possible. The more we're exposed to the media, the more we find out more information, and that in and of itself can create a lot of confusion at times and misinformation. And so when reviewing the event, we're looking to stick to the facts and be as basic as possible, just enough to provide the opportunity for individuals to talk about their experiences and their feelings that they had at the time of the event. When providing psychological first aid, it's important that we as individuals know our scope, know what's within our scope, within our boundaries. And if we find that we're providing that support to an individual that might benefit from further support, for example, trauma processing, the referral then becomes beneficial and necessary at that point in time. So knowing that there is information, whether it's through handouts, whether it's websites or other sources that might be beneficial to them in addition to the psychological first aid that they're receiving. And if you do find that it's necessary to refer them on for further treatment, discussing with them what they can expect. What does treatment look like? What does trauma processing look like? What are the different stages and phases to talking about a traumatic event, just so that they're more prepared and ready for the process that it entails. When helping a traumatized individual, it's important to realize that trauma is so individual. The things that I might consider traumatizing or traumatic might not for you be the same fit. And so then it becomes important to know your own social location. And with that, once you take on the role of psychological first aid, not minimizing the experiences that an individual might be having, allowing them to experience the trauma for what it is and how they interpret it in their eyes. That also takes into account the idea of being able to listen openly and be consistently available when they need that support, when they need that listening ear had. It's also important in that sense to know your boundaries, maintain your boundaries. Again, knowing when the information that they might disclose is too much, that trauma processing might be beneficial, and knowing when you are comfortable as well with what you're hearing as it relates to the details of the event. Being aware of outstanding feelings, being aware of the natural, normal reactions to a trauma. As both Dr. Shlik and Katie mentioned, there is that natural process that you're going to experience following an incident. The re-experiencing, the avoidance, the anxiety, those are natural experiences that happen after an event happens. And so being able to accept that, that's part of the natural recovery of a traumatic event. The last point looks at the exposure to media accounts, and I think that's an extremely important piece to keep in mind, particularly as a traumatic event happens unexpectedly. There's going to be increased media exposure, and so minimizing that or having that in moderation, just again to minimize the amount of confusion that might be caused or the amount of misinformation that might be impacted. Oftentimes, overexposure to the media account can impact sleep. It can impact your concentration level. It can have its adverse impacts if we're not too aware of the impact that it can have. So in what cases do I realize that further support is necessary? When do I realize that it might be beneficial to access more support than just the psychological first aid? At what point is the social support groups or the peer support groups not enough for where I'm at in terms of my recovery? A few things to keep in mind is that psychological first aid might be, for some people, the first response to a traumatic event. For others, it might be important to tap into actual treatment right away as opposed to going through the psychological first aid route. What are the signs of that? Well, we look at thoughts. So looking at thoughts of self-harm, if there's thoughts of suicide, if you're having increasing thoughts of, not wanting to continue with the day, not wanting to wake up in the morning, thoughts of homicide or thoughts of harm towards others, that's one indication that it's important to not just stick with the psychological first aid, but to move into treatment and trauma processing as the next response or the first response. Looking at your behaviors, Dr. Shlik mentioned avoidance being one of the symptoms of PTSD and of trauma. And so have I increased my need to avoid? Have I increased my desire to numb my emotions? Am I drinking more than I used to? Am I using more substances than I used to? And is that, again, becoming for me a safety behavior and a coping mechanism? Am I engaging in risky behaviors or dangerous behaviors? Is there an inability to care for myself? Have I decreased my need or my care when it comes to hygiene? Has my sleep suffered? My eating habits and nutrition, have those also taken a toll and been impacted as a result of the trauma? And if any of these come up as indications, then that's usually a sign that perhaps it's important to seek support right away rather than taking the route of psychological first aid immediately. One of the important pieces to remember, as previously mentioned as well, is that most of us will experience at some point in our lives a traumatic situation. We're all going to experience that. 70% of us will experience a trauma in our lives. And so it's not everybody who experiences a trauma that develops PTSD. So it's important then to look at what are some of the risk factors. What is it that causes two individuals who encounter the same situation to have one person that develops PTSD as a result of it, but the other person who may not develop PTSD, even though they may be traumatized? Some of the things to take into consideration is their family history. Is there a family history of mental illness for that individual? Have they experienced past traumatic situations? Are there either childhood trauma or previous adulthood trauma, layers of trauma, that this just exasperates that situation? And as a result of the past trauma, has there been maladjustment in how they dealt with the previous traumatic situations? During the trauma, looking at perceived life threat. So was I thinking I'm gonna die? What's gonna happen to me? Is there a thought or perception that my life is in threat or is in danger? Did I experience intense emotions? So the anxiety that I felt, the frightened feelings that I felt, the scared and the sadness that I felt was more intense than I'm normally naturally accustomed to. Dissociation, again, is another piece that's important to take into consideration. And this looks at being able, the ability to detach from reality. And usually you find that folks dissociate at times of high stress or times of heightened, frightened feelings. And so the intention and the hope of dissociation is a coping mechanism. And so at that point in time, I'm gonna dismiss my feelings, dismiss my thoughts at this point in time in order to continue, in order to work and to push forward in the face of danger. After the trauma happens, what is the social support like? Is there a lack of family support? Is there a lack of friend support, work support? Is that something that's lacking, and in return having an impact on one's ability to naturally recover from trauma? What are the life stressors like? What's the home situation like? Work stressors like? These are all factors that take into consideration when looking at the impact that can be used in developing PTSD. Early symptoms. And so as mentioned before, we all are going to experience at some point after the trauma symptoms, whether it's re-experiencing, whether it's avoidance, whether it's thinking about the situation in intensity. But do these symptoms after a month after the incident, do they still last in the same level of intensity? Have they decreased or have they still remained at that same level? And if so, then you've experienced or one is experiencing early symptoms of PTSD, and further support is beneficial at that point. So Brian and Scott have a quote that say, post-traumatic stress disorder occurs when we start to organize our lives around trauma. And so we talked about safety behaviors. And safety behaviors, in the sense, we consider that behaviors that we've done in order to make ourselves feel safe, in order to feel more protected, more safe, more careful in certain situations. On the other side of the house, safety behaviors often impede our ability to naturally recover from trauma, as Dr. Shlik mentioned. They become roadblocks in our ability to naturally recover. And so some examples of safety behaviors when we think about in light of last week's event, have I switched or have I changed my route to work now to avoid driving past the memorial? Have I adapted how I interact with people? Have I decreased my downtown core? Are there things that I've done now as a result of the incident that I consider safety behaviors, but really, in fact, they become avoidance, right? In the sense that they prevent us from naturally recovering from a traumatic situation. And so we look at duration. How long is this lasting for? Have these symptoms lasted for more than a month? What's the intensity? Is it the same level of intensity that, again, it was at the time that the incident happened, even a month after the fact? And impairment. What's the impact and the implication that this is having on my family life, on my work life, my ability to concentrate, my ability to be present with the family, my ability to take care of my hygiene, my sleep, my eating? What have been the implications of these as a result of the traumatic event? So accessing different resources become helpful, tapping into some natural supports, whether it's family, talking about the incident together as a family, talking about it amongst your friends, your colleagues, using that as your psychological first aid with your coworkers, clergy, community groups. I know a lot of employees and employee workplaces offer EAP programs. So tapping into that, even if it's a one-off session with the therapist, to be able to express your thoughts, your concerns, your feelings, that becomes at least beneficial at that point in time. And if you're looking for more professional support, tapping into the registered mental health professionals, whether it's psychology or psychiatry or social work. And these can all be found on the various college disciplines website, where they can direct you to these disciplines that are available in whatever area you're from. So you have a list of registered clinicians in that area. The OSI Connect app is another good tool that becomes helpful. I know that these are out in the foyer there. It's a free app that you can all download if you have a smartphone or an iPhone. And what it does is it provides self-screeners. There's information on there, there's videos on there. And it not only serves the benefits of an individual who's been traumatized, but for those who are supportive, those who are in a caregiving role, whether you're a spouse or a child. There are videos on there that explain to you the benefits or what exactly contains a trauma. There's other resources as well there and websites that can be accessed as well. So as I conclude, the important piece to keep in mind is that there are resources available. There is support available and there's help available. There's distress lines available as well too for more immediate crisis-related services if the waiting becomes an issue or a concern. And so these are the numbers that are available both in the Ottawa area and the surrounding communities that you can access for crisis-related services. And they're available for you as individuals or for significant others who you feel might benefit from accessing some of these services. And so this concludes my presentation, our presentation for this evening. Again, thank you for your time, and it's nice to see the outpour of support. This is definitely a national trauma, and so the national support becomes extremely important in helping us to create that Ottawa Strong that we're working towards. Thank you.